Earthcross, Lore in the Age of Memories. Prelude, excerpted from Salman Sorain's Fundamentals of Faith and Mana, once required curriculum for pupils of the Mark in many lesser Magimilitary academies, more recently challenged for blasphemy. Chapter 1, Zoengaard. None remain who know the truth of Zoengard. There was a being of godlike power called Zoengard. This much is certain. The weapons and tactics, the magics and magemetal, the cities and strongholds, and the knowledge and ambitions he passed down to humanity have been called blessings by some, and curses by others. Many who would have died lived because of Zoengard, and many who would have lived died. Much of the world, especially the lands of the country now called Birthland, and its cities and armies and industry, exists because of him. All know this, but unknown remains his true nature. His true acolytes, some might say fanatics, hold as evident truth that Zoengard was and is the one true god who forged the world entire from raw magic 4,000 years ago, that he created the hills and the plains and the seas by his own hands and molded humans and beasts from clay of his own making. Perhaps that he birthed Khan itself. This is considered a fringe view even amongst most highly pious Zolish. Many who hold to it have proven suspicions of extremism well-founded through the ages, occasionally making war and demanding acknowledgement of the one true god Zoengard at spear point. Such bloodshed has even extended to their fellow Zolish, those whose only sacrilege is praising the Almighty in the wrong manner. Most Birthlanders say that the world existed before Zoengard, but hold as evident truth that he was a god on high who fell to earth, perhaps by his own intention, perhaps by error, or perhaps cast down by others of his godly order for his warriors' ways. Some even say the world once had a third moon, Zoen, and that uniquely magical moon, grown bored in the cold eternity of space, let itself plummet from the sky wearing the visage of a man. Whether or not this sky-fallen origin of Zoengard is accurate, it is forever wrought in ink on the world's maps. The great inland sea of Birthland has been known as Zoenfall for long millennia, styled such as it is said to be the impact site of Zoengard's meteoric fall from the heavens above. Then there are the skeptics of the world who hold as evident truth that Zoengard was born but an ordinary human of flesh and bone, grown from mother's womb as any other, but a human whom through skill or genius or perhaps even sheer luck in coming upon the secrets of Khan attained power easily mistaken for godhood. Some regard this as the highest blasphemy. Others claim it grants Zoengard the deepest respect of all beliefs, crediting him with shaping history with the same base-born human potential that millions who yet live also possess. Still others, the Terzolish, hold to the presence of gods but believe the human, Zoengard, was their chosen vessel or prophet on earth. Those who love or fearfully worship, who rarely but occasionally pray to or are even entirely indifferent to Zoengard, may hold any of these beliefs. The most reverent may feel he was but a man who rose to become the world's savior. The most apathetic that he created all lands and peoples before turning his back on them, now removed from earthly concerns. But those who hate and spit on the name Zoengard, who believe his gifts blighted the world or keep faith to Acacia, may also hold divergent views. Some believe Zoengard is the demented and vile creator who descended to torture his humans, his playthings, or that he fell from heaven to earth specifically to make war, or even that he was a blasphemous human who attained unholy power through treachery and used it to rise up against the true gods. The truth of Zoengard is forever obscured, forever debated, forever puzzled over, forever warred over, forever lost. But the world as it is now known stands forever in the shadow of his influence. Chapter 2, Magemetal. Much as the origins and nature of Zoengard, the origins and nature of magemetal, his greatest gift and greatest curse unto humanity, remain forever debated and shrouded in mystery. Some scholars say that magemetal was discovered by Zoengard in its molten form in deep, forbidden caverns with its magical properties already intact, a gift from higher gods, or a physical manifestation of the planet's Khan, or merely a geological aberration, but one that, whatever its origin, Zoengaard drew from the earth and bent to his will. More pious folk dismiss such views and insist that Zoengaard created mage metal whole cloth by his own hands, a feat of genius and sorcery. Others take a view that straddles these ends, saying a subterranean river of molten silver holding infinite mystic potential was found by Zoengaard, who infused it with his own Khan to create the substance, now known as mage metal. This legend still praises its creation as a feat of genius and sorcery, perhaps unequaled across the ages, simply one enacted on pre-existing material. Wherever mage metal came from, what is known is that since being unleashed upon the world by Zoengaard, it has been both used in and the cause of wars since time immemorial. Its creation may be godly in nature, but today the mage metal mining and trading industries form the far less spiritual and more material economic foundation of the West. The armaments forged from and the military, engineering, and magical application of rare mage metal make it worth its weight in gold. No trivial claim, as it is many times the weight of gold, or indeed of any other ore on Earth. Households, armies, and modest fortunes have been traded for mage metal weaponry. Discovery of untapped mage metal can instantly turn the most backwater mining town into a thrumming metropolis of plank and mud for as long as the vein holds. Whether found, infused, or created, it was Zoengaard who carried into civilization the basic form of mage metal, the impossibly dense and Khan-sensitive ore that runs from white to silvery black to midnight black, depending on purity. But it was the three other great gods or sorcerers of the Age of Memories, Zoengaard's student, Tiamos, his daughter, Jaya, and Acacia, Lady of Wind and Shade, who discovered how the purest white mage metal could be bent to their own wills. It was Tiamos who used the white to create gold star metal, the stuff of elemental wizardry. Jaya crafted green cure metal to heal and soothe, and it was Acacia who forged crimson witch metal, mana of necromancers, the use of which is to this day widely frowned upon and considered blasphemous. Not that a blind eye isn't turned when there's gold to be made. Chapter 3. 4 Schools of Mage Metal. Heed well the ways of mage metal, for they may one day save your life. Part 1. White, silver, and black mage metal. Associated with Zoengaard, the signature property of this base form of mage metal is its sheer weight. Even the lightest and purest white mage metal is far heavier than its equivalent size in lead or gold. The largely unknown mystical impurities that make it darker make it vastly heavier still. A chunk of true midnight black mage metal the size of a common apple can weigh 40 or 50 pounds. Though such dense metal has its roles in engineering and fortification, the substance is so vanishingly rare that it is not generally used for such matters, iron and steel deemed sufficient. Instead, as with many of Earth's gifts, mage metal is more commonly directed toward the cause of war. There are rare people who can channel Khan from the earth and hold it within their bodies, said to be less than 1 in 100, with the equivalent fraction of that small group being truly gifted. These folk can learn to link their own Khan signatures to mage metal and lift, hold, swing, and shield themselves with it as if it were a fraction of its true weight, so long as it is touching their flesh or touching other mage metal that is in turn touching their flesh. Those who can lift mage metal at slightly less than or at half of its true weight may be drafted as laborers or frontline infantry, but common standard holds that one gifted enough to be handed mage metal weapons or armor by their overlord and dubbed a Khan Knight must be able to lift mage metal at a perceived rate of about 1/10 its true weight. Thus a 10-pound chopping sword, able to parry heavy conventional weapons, stab through armor with a strong thrust, and remove limbs or heads with one swing, can be twirled about with the ease of a 1-pound dagger. A mighty 30-pound bastard sword, able to cave in plate and helm and shatter swords and shields, can be wielded as of a 3-pound broadsword. Beyond the heat of direct combat, a 1/4-ton hammer able to break apart walls and doors swung as if merely 50 pounds is a standard tool for ending sieges and assaulting castles. Throwing such weight can also be devastating, though most are hesitant about throwing mage metal or using it in a catapult or arrow or trebuchet for fear of not getting the priceless material back. Mage metal armor is of incalculable use in war. Instead of wearing 40 or 50 pounds of plate, a Khan knight can step into battle wearing hundreds of pounds of mage metal shielding. Such defense is impenetrable by anything less than heavy machinery. The warrior donned in it able to deflect sword and spear and arrows from dozens of foes at once. But this carries lethal risk. If one loses his store of Khan or connection with the earth while holding mage metal in hand, he will simply become unwieldy with, or drop the weapon. But if he does so while clad in 500 pounds of armor, his body can be twisted or crushed to death in an instant. Because of this, wearing mage metal armor is considered a far more advanced skill than wielding a mage metal weapon, one few alive stand masters of. There have been true prodigies, those 1 in millions, even amongst the Khan attuned, who can handle mage metal at a perceived rate of 1/20th or 1/30th its true weight. When they wield pure black mage metal weaponry, none can stand against such a being and live. The calamity a sharpened 100-pound broadsword can carve on the battlefield needs little elaboration, nor does the conclusive power of a half-ton hammerhead. Few who have ever lived have been mighty enough with Khan to wear a full suit of black mage metal plate, but in the instances in history where one has stepped onto the battlefield wielding over a ton of armor, impenetrable by anything less than an earthquake, wielding black mage metal axe, lance, or daggers, woe unto that man's enemies, be they hundreds or thousands. At that point, such a destroyer's ability to devastate men, armies, castles, and whole cities is limited only by his eventual need to sleep. Part 2. Gold mage metal, also called star metal. Associated with Tiamos and created from the purest white mage metal, gold mage metal, or star metal, is the most versatile and mysterious of all forms, hence those gifted in its use being called wizards. Star metal need not be wielded by hand. It can instead be worn in the form of earrings, necklaces, rings, bracelets, or even embedded into the flesh of those attuned to its power. This physical contact can gift an array of wizardry, such as the ability to wield concussive psionic force, or to summon, hold, and throw fire, or to manipulate electric energies. Some can even charge slivers of star metal, which can then be set off to destroy the star metal, whilst creating immense blasts, able to vaporize all stone, steel, and flesh within a radius of 10 or 20 feet. Large rods of golden star metal can also alter the weather or the earth itself if given proper tribute to in strange rituals by those able to manipulate their magics. This can have destructive application, bringing quakes or storms to one's enemies, but it can also, given luck and skill, summon a bountiful harvest or soothing rain to one's own land. There is a major drawback to such wizardry of earth and sky. Whether successful or no, the gold is permanently drained from the mage metal in the ritual as it retreats back to plain white. The bigger the star metal fragment used, the more certain the spell will work, though most are hesitant to drain the power of too much of this very finite, very scarce, very precious resource at one time. A few truly gifted are able to master both the physical skills of silver mage metal and the magical skills of the gold, becoming wizard knights. Such beings wield pure star metal weaponry in battle, fighting with massively heavy golden swords and halberds, while simultaneously using their magic. Some even fling psionic or fire blasts directly from the tips of their weapons. Part 3. Green mage metal, also called cure metal, associated with Jaya, whose creation of this holy substance marked the turning point in the long-raging Akkadian Wars. Pale green mage metal is called cure metal for its healing properties. A specifically Khan-attuned healer wearing or holding cure metal can lay hands to dull pain, staunch blood loss, heal minor injury, set bones, soothe illness, or break fever. Its magic does not give way to miracles. To be stabbed through the heart or the skull is still to be dead, nor can it instantly heal a truly grievous wound. But what it can do is enormously accelerate the treatment of the injured or ill, given the same medical attention and bed rest that would be required for a conventional recovery process. Thus, most who wield Khan and cure metal are trained in the mundane healing arts as well, such as medicinal herbs, basic stitching, and the cleaning of wounds. But in times of conflict, even those born to save and soothe may not be allowed to live in peace. Channelers found to be natural healers are often drafted by the militaries of the world, hastily trained in the spear and sent into wars both foreign and domestic to serve near the front lines. There have been great warriors as such, medic knights, equally gifted in destroying their enemies and mending their countrymen. But more often, such drafted healers are tasked with keeping the arrow fodder on the front lines, marching and fighting through the pain and the terror as long as possible before eventual death and replacement by a new front line, or perhaps keeping the high lords and commanders comfortable if might they take a scratch. As with star metal, cure metal can be drained of its color through overuse. Once reverted to pure white mage metal, it will remain white mage metal forever, its healing properties gone. However, unlike with gold and star metal, in which this is an irrevocable one-way process, partially spent green cure metal, if left with even the slightest mana, will very slowly return to full power. This recovery can take hours, days, or weeks, depending on how large and how spent the fragment is, but given patience, it is assured. Healers often wear cure metal in much the same fashion as wizards their star metal. It is crafted into bracelets, earrings, or necklaces, or even embedded into or tattooed onto their flesh. Rings are rarer, as heavy weight on the fingers may impede precise stitching. Some healers employed by wealthy lords or hospitals may even have medical instruments lined with or made of cure metal. Tiny slivers may be left inside the bodies of those grievously wounded to aid recovery, or larger, priceless chunks of it in the bodies of deathly ill monarchs looking to extend their lives. This can indeed work, though it will eventually drain the cure metal, which when recovered after death is reverted to white mage metal. There are songs of phenomenally powerful medic knights wielding green cure metal blades in combat, alternating between cutting down their enemies with heavy edge and placing flat against their allies' wounds to instantly scab them over. Such heroes are said to have turned the tides of battles and entire wars as surely as any Khan Knight or Wizard Knight. Part 4. Red Mage Metal, also called Witch Metal, associated with Acacia, Lady of Wind and Shade, Scourge of the Age of Memories. Red witch metal animates, animating corpses to become gaunts, rock to become golems, trees to walk, and common ice to roam the cold and forgotten highlands, as living beings of frost and snow. Some Acasians even boast that it was their goddess who in the Age of Memories used witch metal to fuse lizards and giant ants with the spirits of men, giving birth to the Shiorifal and the Kororaki, reptile folk and insect folk, though as contact between humanity and reptile folk precedes the Akkadian Wars and dawn of witch metal, such views are considered ahistorical. To access the magic of witch metal, one must reach beyond feeling out the Khan of the earth or of the elements. They must reach into the other side, into death itself. The specifics of such spells are unknown and largely forbidden, but it has been said that in drawing the nothingness from that which they seek to animate toward the great nothing beyond, a spark of Khan that approximates life will flood into the resultant vacuum. As a shard of witch metal must be left inside each animated gaunt or golem,
There is a theoretical point at which this form of magic will be entirely spent for all time, but the shard to animate a common gaunt can be as small as a speck of dust, and a fragment of witch metal the size of an egg can animate hundreds of gaunts. So witch metal's point of no return may yet be for centuries to come. Due to its association with acacia, use of this form of mage metal is frowned upon and illegal, at least officially. Few are naive enough to doubt that the labor of golems is often turned a blind eye to, especially in mining operations. The use of the walking corpses called gaunts, however, calls acacia to mind too directly and is more strictly enforced. A necromancer is tolerated nowhere but perhaps the farthest reaches of the ice wilds or Castus, where royal armies care not march to enforce the law of the realms.
Book 1, The Age of Memories. From the writings of Monk Iodasus, chronicler of the 93rd Order of Jaya, one of thousands of accounts of the Age of Memories and Acacian Wars housed in the Zelestrian archives. Chapter 1, Zoenfall. Like much as regards ancient times, the singers and scholars and theologians all weave different, sometimes contradictory tales of the Age of Memories. It is the most God-fearing who hold that there was no lower age preceding this time, only void. It was into this void, they say, Almighty Zoengaard created the world entire, lands and seas, flora and fauna, humanity itself, all forged at once by his infinite power. Those who hold to such beliefs may yet argue when Zoengaard's Great Awakening took place. Some claim the world was crafted tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, but most align with historians and mainstream Zolish thought that Zoengaard arrived about 4 millennia ago, perhaps slightly sooner. The purest of faith merely take issue with the notion that this followed the 12,000 to 25,000 year lower age, which followed the eons-long Age of Beasts, which followed Void. Common belief is that Zoengard arrived in Audlin falling as a meteor from the heavens, making impact in the inland sea now called Zoenfall. Setting forth, he is said to have discovered a land still barbaric and untamed, but not absent the early murmurs of human civilization. Agriculture, the breeding of livestock, mud and wood construction, tiny clustered villages, and of course, a base understanding of warfare and stone weaponry were already known, but it was Zoengard who birthed a new world. The people of Audlin knelt swiftly before his brief but terrifying show of the power of Khan, the magical lifeblood of our world. He rewarded their loyalty with knowledge in architecture and metalworking and, once deemed worthy, the ability to touch Khan themselves. And for a time Audlin flourished. Nearly all, not just Zolish faithful, but historians and even scholars who deny the divinity of Zoengard and insist he was but a man, agree that what powers he possessed granted him awesome lifespan. Scattered records from independent lands and cultures suggest that he played a direct role in world affairs for at least 100, if not hundreds, of years. Zoengard was involved in the cultivation of nearly all of northern Audlin, his reach only falling short of the ice wilds and the western reach beyond the mountains. These seeds of civilization then spread outward. Audlin's peoples explored, traded, and sometimes colonized and crusaded throughout lands beyond the sea with the vessels he helped them create. Zoengard would disappear for a year or two at a time, but emerge when civil unrest inevitably reared its head amongst the few dozen petty nations of northern Audlin. He would then often leave a chieftain, ruling council, or priest to maintain order in his absence, before vanishing again. It was some decades after Zoenfall that the Almighty set off across the foreboding southern deserts, today known as Old Audlin. Details of his activities in these years are scant. What slivers of information exist known only from a few long, faded scrolls kept by the northernmost desert towns. None of the country's Shiori Fall have ever shared their tales of contact with Zoengard, as this era may precede the dawn of writing and recorded history for their race. This knowledge is likely lost. It is known that reptile folk first revealed themselves to humanity shortly after this time.
Many believe Zoengaard played a role in inspiring this initially disastrous, but eventually fruitful contact. From there, it is said Zoengard set off east across the Center Sea. Some claim riding an ocean chariot of gold and ruby fish, though this may be a flourish of overly poetic priests. He first contacted and explored the Center Sea's vast archipelagos before setting sail to countries and continents of the east and south, lands today called Kishi, Zolshar, the Kingdom of Isantis, the Skull Lands, Jurdagen, and others, though they all possess different borders and, except ancient Kishi, likely all carried different names then. Only great icy northern Zal-Alder seems to have no verbal or written record of any visit from Zoengard during his time on Earth. Truth regarding the role he played in the early governance of these countries remains elusive. Some say he handed them the seeds of modern civilization as he did Audlin. Others boast that their nascent lands actually fought back against his intrusion. It is accepted that the islands of the Center Sea, today called Novia at least, greeted him warmly. There are many largely Zolish regions of Novia still today, especially in the northern isles. Those of a more pantheistic view say he worked in concert with the other gods of the known and unknown world, both learning and advising. From those like him who took human shape, from the great golden bird of Kishi and others of beastly visage, from towering mountains with faces and voices, even from more formless and elusive spirits of the flames and oceans and skies. Those more skeptical would claim this is just the Zolish, putting a pious mask on a grandiose but otherwise ordinary worldwide sojourn of trade and diplomacy. Some would point out, for instance, that the great golden bird of Kishi isn't even definitively known to have first been worshipped until hundreds of years later. Nevertheless, Zoengard's decades of travel and evangelism yielded success. There are those in Novia, Kishi, the Kingdom of Isantis, and brave corners of Jurdagen who praise his name to this day, but there were two grave errors some argue led to his downfall. First, the children of Northern Audlin had never been without father's supervision for so long since his arrival, and they had misbehaved. Civil war was abound. Many chieftains had begun styling themselves kings, and were attempting to violently expand their territories, most notably King Fane of the northern clans. The southern border had also exploded into conflict, with Shiorifal led by High Lizard Drosk. And with Zoengard's company throughout his journey had been glimpsed a woman by the name of Acacia. Chapter 2. Civil Wars of Audlin. Zoengard returned from his travels to a land of chaos. In his absence, the metalworking and military tactics that he had gifted onto the people they had turned on themselves. Chieftains and several newly self-styled kings of the 30 or so countries and realms of northern Audlin were forging weapons, conscripting armies, and playing at war. From the northern mountains to the southern deserts, and throughout the central woodlands and eastern and western reaches, neighbor slew neighbor, villages burned, and much was misery and woe. In the northern mountains, now called Alor, scholars believe the barbarian clans had fought each other over resources, over lands, over women, perhaps just for the thrill of it, for hundreds of years before Zoengard's arrival. Some say for thousands of years, stretching back to when they were but hairless apes, striking out from caves with the sharpest sticks they could find. Thus, one of Zoengard's fine and proud achievements had been cobbling a shaky but lasting peace in the mountains, civilization taking a foothold there. But it seemed a barbarian kingdom of thousands could strike out just as surely, nay, vastly more deadly still, than mere clans of dozens. In Zoengard's long absence, King Fane had assumed violent control of many once independent barbarian tribes. He then grew jealous of the green realms to the east, sending raids and claiming yet more lands and warriors and villages as his own. Fane's new empire of blood grew more the more people knelt, an achievement the barbarians of the lower age had never dreamed of. In the southern deserts, the Shiorifal had made contact with the humans of central Audlin, just south of where sands merge into plains. None know who struck first, humans or reptiles, but as new civilizations met, they with sad inevitability just as swiftly drew weapons on each other. The south was now ablaze with perpetual war, the largest Audlin had yet known,
the continent's first true armies had taken the field. Tactics such as a military draft, rations, fortifications, battle lines, and shield walls, all being applied simultaneously for the first time. Humanity had initially seemed to reign triumphant over these scaly, primitive southerners, but an oddly brilliant and tactical fall called High Lizard Drosk emerged to lead his people. Drosk's new guerrilla and assassination tactics had turned the tide. The reptiles took up the weapons and armor of the fallen at increasing rates, human villages within the grassland borders being overrun for the first time. And there were a dozen other warring kings and chieftains besides. Organized bandits struck out from the central old woodlands. Marauding zealots even claimed to wield sword and mace and torch in Zoengaard's own name. The land bled. Some say Zoengard wept to find what had become of his gifts. Others, that his wrath was terrible. Perhaps both. Some skeptical of Zoengard's divinity or his goodness say he was pleased to see what had become of Audlin, that humanity had grown learned and savage in the art of war. Others still believed that Zoengaard was both a mere human, but also a hero, seeing the civil wars as a wrong to be righted. And where Zoengard and his company traveled, wrongs were righted. Raiders were driven back. Shaky peace returned to strongholds and villages, fields and farmlands again grown green with harvest. Until Zoengard left, to continue his campaigns to the north or south or east or west, or north again. Then fighting resumed, as if stirred from light slumber. Lesser kings and chieftains were defeated, but they were as weeds. King Thane and High Lizard Drosk pressed on even as they lost battles, replenishing their armies and stores whenever the Great One again vanished to another far-flung battlefront. For if even those most skeptical of Zoengard's godhood will acknowledge that no mortal man, no score of men, could stand against him in combat and live, even those most pious will acknowledge that on Earth he was bound by physical form. He possessed no omnipotent sight, nor the ability to fly as if a falcon. Zoengard could lead a victorious battle, wield terrifying magics, and reduce any opponent to red mist and memory in a duel. But he could not seem to give common folk what they needed to continue winning battles in his absence, nor root out Thane or Drosk amidst the endless thousands of miles of mountain or desert. A new weapon was needed to gift to the peoples of Audlin. A new escalation. No one lives who knows whether Zoengard created or found this weapon, or forged it from raw silver and con, but all the world over know its name. Magemetal. Chapter 3. The Dawn of Magemetal. For the long decades con had been known, a rare subset of humans had always been able to touch it in a manner that was a whisper of how Zoengard did. But one man or woman in 100 being able to enjoy a brief flush of heightened senses and increased strength and stamina meant little in the grand game of war. If anything, the con-attuned were motivated to hide their gifts in such trying times, lest they be drafted for heavy labor or the front lines. But a new era of history began when Zoengard emerged from the mountains bearing silvery white mage metal. A new era for the civil wars of Audlin, for all wars of the future, for trade and economies and sciences, for commoners and warriors and kings. Like much and most involving Zoengard, the specifics of how he attained this holy ore remain obscured and contested. Only the involvement of a subterranean river of mystic, molten silver, deeper beneath Earth's surface than any ever before journeyed, seems universally accepted. Some literal-minded scholars of earthly science say that Zoengard discovered mage metal, its magical properties already intact and imbued into it by the con of the planet itself. That he then cooled and hardened a portion, carried it to the surface as was, and that this is where the tale of mage metal's origin ends. A small subset of a more faithful but pantheistic bent agree it was discovered, but say Zoengard dueled a god of the inner earth, equally divine, or of an even higher order than himself, triumphing to win the right to the mage metal. But this view does not seem to account for mage metal being excavated soon thereafter in continents hundreds or thousands of miles from Audlin, nor for the toll the awakening of mage metal took on Zoengard himself. Scholars who cling to it are thus often considered stubborn.
The most pious say that Zoengaard created this silver magemetal river from his own hands, standing in the deep earth's very heart of Khan to grant himself the power. Though few deny Zoengaard's gifts, the view that he created all magemetal at once does not seem to account for raw, untapped veins still being discovered throughout the world thousands of years later. Most widely believed is that Zoengaard did indeed find, not create, an underground river of molten silver in a cavern in which no man or beast had ever stood, that he then channeled every bit of his Khan and magic and the energies of the deep earth around him to imbue it with his own powers. Powers man should perhaps never have been allowed to touch. Some of what he created was carried out with him, less than he normally could have borne due to his weakened state. Far more continued to flow throughout the planet's depths, finding its resting grounds in the mountains and hills of far-flung lands and in deep lakes and darkest ocean. Belief ends and history begins with the fact that through magemetal Zoengaard finally, after long decades or perhaps a century of teaching in vain, found a means by which humanity could wield his power as their own. Zoengaard gifted enchanted silver to those he deemed worthy, along with the knowledge to forge and to brandish it. Though unlikely they were initially styled such, this is when what would now be called the first Khan Knights arose, a holy order wielding mighty shields and weapons of white, silver, or even gleaming black mage metal, orders of magnitude denser, stronger, heavier, more impervious, and more powerful than any metal the world had ever seen before. Sometimes a lone Khan Knight led a regiment of ordinary warriors, inspiring and driving them onward. Sometimes several marched in the vanguard of a larger battalion. On occasion, not but a score of vastly outnumbered Khan Knights charged into battle by themselves. Whichever way, most minor civil wars that had racked Audlin drew to swift conclusion. Those clad in mage metal armor liberated villages. They cut down marauding kings and their soldiers as the spear tips and arrows broke against them by the hundreds. Some remained behind to maintain peace and quell resurgent violence in Zoengaard's absence as he moved on across the continent. Casualties on Zoengaard's side plummeted. Word of these mage metal soldiers spread wide. Smaller armies would drop their arms and run, or kneel at the sight of them. More than a few battles were won without a drop of blood being spilled. Within months, peace had again taken hold in much of northern Audlin. A few rebel kings and chieftains and crusading battle priests who had followed rules of war were allowed to keep their titles. Most were not, but were allowed to pass their leadership without issue onto others less ambitious, as chosen by Zoengaard. Others, who had slaughtered and enslaved without qualm in their warmongering, were themselves butchered, their households put to the torch, their crowned and charred corpses hanged as a warning to all. Amongst the woodland bandits were a few with Khan potential. These promising thieves were permitted to waive their punishments in exchange for military service, utilizing their unique blend of high and low talents. The central realms, the eastern and western reaches, and even some of the edges of the northern mountains began to rebuild. The creation and gifting of mage metal onto the people had seen spectacular victory, and soon Zoengaard's companies turned their sights to King Fane and High Lizard Drosk. But there was one secret Zoengaard held inward. He was dying. Chapter 4: Disciples of Zoengaard. Zoengaard was not dying swiftly by human standards, as his decades of known activity beyond this point can attest. But the sagas tell that at this time his feats of strength became, while still incredible, less so. Often not beyond those of the most gifted but decidedly human Khan Knights he led. He began showing signs of pain for the first time, and gray appeared about his temples. Some explain this as mere aging. He was a being of advanced years, to say the least, but others would call it result of him pouring everything he had, all his Khan and every fiber of strength into the creation of mage metal, so that thousands could wield said strength instead of but one. Thus it became key that Zoengaard pass his skills and knowledge onto others. He took many pupils, and his mage metal legions swelled. Khan Knight orders whose names remain as legendary as those of the Dor Draxius,
the Grey Lions, and the Pure Hearts first appear in some histories even as early as these days, before the Calamity. But his three foremost pupils were Tiamos, Elumorn, and Acacia, the disciples of Zoengard. Many chronicles call them human sorcerers he discovered and deemed uniquely worthy during his travels. Holy books and singers often name them three fellow celestials who joined him down on Earth. It is a matter of much theological dispute, and thousands of years later, none can say. Tiamos, golden and stout, mirthful and merry, was known of far greater passions for earthly pleasures in drink, song, and love than Zoengard or his fellow disciples. It is unlikely that Zoengard, of grim nature and valuing only the ways of the scholar, the builder, and the warrior, would have so favored one were his talents not beyond reproach. And as Tiamos has since become known as the father of wizardry and creator of star metal, so clearly they were, he surrounded himself with not only the mightiest but also the wisest of the con-touched, the tinkers and innovators, for he saw in magemetal great potential, yet untapped. Tiamos was deployed north to conclude this barbarian business and defeat King Fane once and for all. Thus he and his golden legions marched, experimenting on the rich magemetal deposits of the mountains along the way. The true chronology is unknown. Singers prefer to tell that Tiamos crafted the golden magemetal called star metal during his northern campaign. Such tellings conclude with he and his wizards setting upon King Fane's mountain stronghold, wielding flame and lightning, earning immediate surrender from mighty barbarians who weep in terror at these alien powers. Others label this poetic fantasy and declare that the final battles of the northern campaign were waged with but standard magemetal armaments, star metal not being crafted for years or even decades hence. But what is known is that King Fane was defeated. He was allowed to live, most say, as not to further inflame his people, but his crown was cast aside, his army shattered, his territories reduced from vast mountainous country to but a rain puddle in the far north now called Avasmore. It is also known that star metal is the only form of magically infused pure mage metal sometimes found in nature. This makes it near certain that some manner of experimental trickery was afoot by Golden Tiamos, whether at this time or years later. Sad Silver Elumorn, said to be of even more somber disposition than Zoengard himself, took up guardianship of the Central Plains and Old Woodlands. He and his Sorrow Guard were at first frightening to witness. Eerie silent in battle, they wore elongated inhuman helmets and wielded dim magemetal great shields which seemed to drink the very light, twisted, weeping faces etched upon them. But this chilling visage is now thought to have been but for show and to imbue discipline, for alone amongst major Khan Knight orders, none of the Sorrow Guard were ever known to perform wicked acts against peasant or take up arms against Zoengard himself. Commoners who wished for quiet and tranquil life in Elumorn's domain eventually came to associate these bizarre weeping shields with peace. All would rejoice at their twisted faces if brigands marshaled or beasts gathered outside the village gates. Then there was Acacia, sorceress of copper and wind, of shade and venom, of talents such that Tiamos and Elumorn could never dream of aspiring to. Acacia had been glimpsed in Zoengard's company for long years before these days. Many thus conclude her to be a human woman who joined him on his travels, a student, a follower, or even a lover. Many hold that even if Tiamos and Elumorn were human, Acacia alone was surely a goddess, or perhaps devil, who joined him from a higher plane of existence, or a lower. She wore not plate, but a black and crimson cloak woven with mage metal throughout. She walked at the head of her company barefoot and without helm, striding into the southern deserts on Zoengard's command to meet High Lizard Drosk absent a trace of fear. The assassination and guerrilla tactics of the Shiori Fall proved mere annoyance to her seemingly limitless abilities to avoid them, trap them, deflect them, and subvert their plans. She quickly cultivated reptile spies who fed her intelligence, causing further breakdown of their order. Many conquered human lands of northern Audlin were reconquered in kind. Walled villages or strongholds deeply fortified as reptile territory were simply sealed from outside and burned to rubble with the fall inside at Acazia's command. Eventually, his tactics failed. High Lizard Drosk was forced to march in conventional warfare against Acacia and her Khan Knights. Her Awoken Horde, they were called. Their powers and perfection with black magemetal lances and axes and armor made it a short war, indeed. In the end, Acacia fought High Lizard Drosk in single combat on the cliffs of Shieldspire. Drosk donned spiked iron plate and wielded wicked, curved blades. Acacia was absent armor or weapon save a black gown and common wooden staff. She cast Drosk from the highest peak, while the lightning raged and her soldiers witnessed, singing their love for her in howling, discordant ecstasy. The civil wars of Audlin were finished, but the true war of the Age of Memories, which would make these years of blood appear the tussling of children, had not yet begun. Chapter 5. The Lost Disciple. Acacia's southern victory was met with rebuke by her lord. Zoengaard held no love for Drosk, but he knew the ways of diplomacy, when to show force and when to stay the sword. As with King Fane in the north, he is thought to have wished for the great reptile to be spared, but instead the High Lizard was broken upon the rocks of Shieldspire. Zoengard knew that for every few Shiori fall to bow and retreat, another in Drosk's death would have found their martyr. War could rage for years, for centuries, for millennia. And so it has been, with border skirmishes and the occasional upstart fall warlord being a facet of life in southern Birthland to this day. And so, despite her delivering peace unto his realms, despite her being his greatest disciple, despite her perfect magemetal legions, despite her bringing glory to his name, Zoengard rebuked Acacia. The philosophical schism between the two was deep, swift, and catastrophic. It is unknown whether Zoengard cast her from his order, or if she rebelled of her own accord. Some more militant Zolish would insist the former, a tribute to their god's iron will. Pious folk of gentler nature swear to it that Zoengard would have craved peace within his own ranks as surely as within the realms he held dominion over. But whoever cleaved their union, it was done. Mere weeks after the end of Audlin's civil wars, Acacia and her Awoken Horde followed in the path Zoengard himself had taken years before, setting out east across the Center Sea. A generation of relative peace again settled over northern Audlin. It was no paradise on Earth. There were indeed reptile incursions, and in the mountainous regions and northwestern reach today called Castus, might still largely made right. The unfortunate could ever then as now be laid low by murder, starvation, the pox, or an especially brutal winter. But war was not made on the lands or its peoples for some time. The Khan Knights and magemetal legions of Zoengard and Elamorn and Tiamos saw to this much. It was also in this time that Zoengard made one of his visions a reality. Perhaps it was the fruit of his own imagination or inspired by wonders he had witnessed in Kishi, but it now stood wrought in brick and wood and steel, Audlin's first true city. Today, this city, which stands between the woodlands and southeastern bay, goes by a different name, but in this age it is said to have been called Kingdom. Boasting walls, a castle, paved districts, and a harbor, its like had never before been seen in Audlin. Zoengard ruled it but briefly, before passing off a crown and at least symbolic rulership to a man he deemed worthy, though perhaps not outstandingly worthy, as that king's name has been long since lost to time, none even claiming him ancestor. But as civilization further took hold in Audlin, the far continent's western reach assumed its place as lands aflame in war. Today, these deserts, cliffs, and drylands are mostly the dominion of Jurtagen and the Skull tribes, though it is believed that in the Age of Memories they stood dozens, perhaps even 100 or more small feuding states. But these numerous tribes had but one new god, or goddess as it were. The Lady of Wind and Shade had returned home to lead her people after her western crusade. It was no clean and absolute union behind her. The Badlands first made war not outward, but on each other about who loved Acacia most fervently. Acacia did not discourage, but instead inflamed these wars, the Easterners teaching themselves military tactics and warriors' ways and creating more powerful weaponry in a continent-spanning trial by fire. After they warred and slaughtered each other into submission, the strongest factions emerged, mostly amidst today's Skull Lands. As Zoengaard had done in Audlin decades, some say a century ago by this point, so too did Acacia. She rewarded the mightiest tribes with ironworking and knowledge and architecture. She then taught them the ways of magemetal, itself recently plentiful among the rock hills and dunes. Nomadic desert bands became towns and legions. Towns became cities. Legions, armies. Common soldiers became Khan Knights, the most skilled drafted into Acacia's awoken horde. Acacia was much loved, and she hated, and her people grew envious of the green lands of game and harvest across the sea their lady told them of.